Okay, thank you, Charles. Thank you all for coming out to this beautiful room this evening. It's absolutely great to see such a fantastic crowd. And I have to say, I'm also just a little bit nervous doing this talk for a number of reasons. One being that it's the first time I'm properly presenting on the Hirschfeld Centre project. Secondly, there are a number of you who participated in the Hirschfeld Centre project here. And thirdly, the Hirschfeld is sacred ground for so many people. I imagine that many of you who are here today were there in that building, and I want to do my best to try and get this history right, to try and be reflective, inclusive of everyone's story. So yeah, here's hoping that this is somewhat informative, but it's only a taster of where I'm at currently. I'm in the middle of writing the book, which is due to Liverpool with a very strict deadline of November. So I've come up for air to try and tell you some of the findings today. Some of the slides are a little bit text heavy. I will absolutely let Charles send them all to you afterwards. This is purely reflective of the fact that I'm currently writing the book and can't necessarily be concise, but I will try to be as concise as possible. So why the hell did I want to look at the Hirschfeld Centre? I mean, I was born in 1992, a significant length of time after the Hirschfeld first started, but when I started doing my PhD was around how Irish gay rights activists used the media to progress their cause and how they used media activism to try and progress their agenda. And when I spoke to every single individual in the community, it always came back to the Hirschfeld Centre for some reason. It was either the first place they ever had a kiss, it was the place they came out to, it was the place they met someone in and went home and had a good time. All of these things emerged from the Hirschfeld, and whether someone was politically involved or simply just socially involved, it was crucial to making them who they were. And I kind of quickly realized, having spoken to so many people, that this institution really did make a culture for many people who were living in the shadows of invisibility. It gave them somewhere to come out to, and it gave them a home in the centre of Dublin. And I was kind of frustrated that that wasn't necessarily in any history books or in any formal place that I could access it. Sure, it's in the Irish Queer Archive. Sure, it's in the back of people's closets. For example, there's a number of people here who have shared a number of resources that they own themselves. But it's not necessarily collectively anywhere for people to engage with these stories. And I think the Hirschfeld trained a generation of people, a generation of activists, to go out there and achieve things such as marriage equality. I would argue without it, some of the progress we made, which was quite rampant in the latter half of the 20th century, may not have happened. So that was what brought me to the Hirschfeld. And I suppose I'm going to start with something maybe a little bit personal before we get into the specifics. So one day I've gone to the building many times. The structure still stands at 10 Fownes Street in Temple Bar. And one day I was standing outside of it and I said to myself, I've never actually gone into this building. I've never actually, even though it's not the same as it was, it's now a vintage shop on the ground floor, and above it is an Airbnb, believe it or not, whereby it's absolutely bougie as hell. So reflective of Dublin now and changing space and place in Dublin as well. A vintage clothes shop and a B&B, which is extortionate, can I just say? Absolutely extortionate. When the price of getting into Flikkers was like £1, like crazy. Now you have to pay $1,500 for a weekend to stay in that Airbnb. So that aside, I kind of went, I want to go into this building and dance with the ghosts of the past. So as I've been speaking to people over the course of the project, and I can share this with you all afterwards if any of you are on Spotify, I've been developing a Flikkers playlist. Everyone remembers the Hirschfeld through a song. Everyone has their own song that brings them back there to the dance floor, which reeked of poppers. And more on that later, more on the poppers later. It's poppers which people slipped over frequently, by the way, and fell all around themselves. But they had a great time. And I said, I want to play this playlist and walk around and just feel what it might have been like. So I played, in particular, Pete Burns's Dead or Alive's track, You Spin Me Round. That song even really stuck with me. I talked to one participant on the project, and he said he was a shy, closeted guy from Finglas and had no confidence in himself. And he was on the edge of the disco at Flikkers, looking in, just wanting to be part of the crowd, but didn't have that necessary confidence to just get in there and muck in and maybe get a kiss and go home with somebody. But anyways, he said Pete Burns's gravelly baritone voice came through the really, really developed sound system. And all of a sudden, as Pete got into the chorus and the track of You Spin Me Round, which is an absolute banger, by the way, he said he just felt a new wave of confidence. The Flikkers dance floor brought him with him. and he had a transformative moment where he was on that dance floor, dancing to that song, and having his first kiss. So I played that song as I walked through the Hirschfeld Centre that day, or what remained of it, and I danced with the ghosts of the past. That is what the Hirschfeld is to me. I can never know what the Hirschfeld meant to the people who went there. The building as it was is now gone. So this project is an attempt to collaborate with the community of those who lived it to understand what the Hirschfeld actually meant. Because the Hirschfeld has multiple meanings to multiple individuals. To some, it was the political institution they went to. To others, it was, lesbians in particular, it was the only place they went to on Thursday nights, whereas gay men had the run of the place for the rest of the week. So there are lots of different relationships that emerge with that. And some people only go there for 3 months and then emigrate to London, but they have that 3 months is one of the best 3 months of their lives. So I'm trying to account for this. So what I'm going to do in today's talk is give you a really brief overview of the emergence of queer spaces and places in Dublin over the course of the 20th century. The reason why I'm just doing this, it's just a dry exercise to show you where the Hirschfeld Centre actually came from. It didn't just happen out of nowhere. Over the course since the founding of the Irish state, there have been spaces for the community that have emerged. Sometimes subterranean, other times underground, sometimes with the community just claiming a space for themselves. So we're going to look at a few of those, and that'll be our little crash course. Now, I mean crash course because it's a really big history. Avril Earls' new book, Love and the Lav, which has just been released in the last week, is available and actually accounts for this period of Irish history. Then I'm going to get into actually waking the Hirschfeld. We called the project Waking the Hirschfeld for a number of reasons. One, we wanted to wake Irish society up to the fact that this place existed. But also, we wanted to give the Hirschfeld a wake in the tradition of the Irish sense of a wake. It meant so much to so many people, but also so many people who crossed through its doors are no longer with us. There's a whole chapter in the book about a generation of beautiful young men who were lost, the Flikkers dance floor becoming decimated as a result of the AIDS crisis. So it's also to provide them a wake to their glorious fun days. So I wish I could share with you a number of themes, because there has been a hell of a lot that has emerged. But for the sake of just an hour, I'm going to go through two in particular. Shared and fractured first encounters with the Hirschfeld Centre, and then, of course, fragmented remembrance and the politics of dance at Flikkers. Flikkers I chose because it's possibly what most people remember the most, and I'll also give you a few little tidbits and gossipy stuff that's come up through as well, because the gossip is always good, right? That can be historical too. So, let us begin on our journey of making queer space and forging queer places, and to the foundation of the Irish state itself. So, from the founding of the Irish Free State in 1923, the sexual liberation and to the sexual liberation movement in Ireland, Dublin's gay social life has thrived in the likes of gay-friendly bars and spaces. Initially, gay men who would have been middle class in the 1920s and the 1930s, who would have been able to identify each other through social circles, would go to the likes of the Shelburne and the Gresham to have a few drinks on a Saturday. Not necessarily a queer space or a gay space, but a space nonetheless for them to congregate. And this is kind of what queer socialization looks like at the middle of the 20th century. And that's the kind of form it takes for many of the years following that. I came across an article by Paul Candon in Gay Community News, who had this delicious tidbit where when the Eucharistic Congress came to Ireland in 1933, and I mean this was like the great demonstration of the new Catholic nation, of Catholic imperialism in this country, and you know, we're really showing the power here. The toilets that were erected for the Eucharistic Congress actually became, shock horror, sites of gay men to have sex with each other. So great to see that inverted and the two fingers being given up to the church in that sense. So the pissoirs were sites of gay encounters, and you see these kinds. Then of course, you know, you have the toilets along the quays and the Phoenix Park emerging as these subterranean sites where the community tends to meet. But from this we tend to get more frequent, right? We have the likes of, from the 1930s onwards, where pubs and cafes become gay friendly. Not necessarily gay institutions or a designated gay bar, but a space where the community can go to. So one such place is Davy Byrne's, which is, and history kind of disputes this fact, whether Davy Byrne was gay himself, but he was buried with his male companion, Now, the nature of that relationship is unclear, but Mary McAuliffe's work, who was here a number of weeks ago, tends to suggest that historically when two people are buried together, that means some sort of romantic connection. So Davy Byrne potentially was actually a gay man and was encouraging some sort of clientele of a particular kind to come in. And it became a discreet hub for gay patrons, especially those who were coming from the Theatre Royal around the corner. And again, shock horror that a few gay men would be in the theatre scene. Wouldn't shock anyone. The Bailey then, of course, starts attracting people during the 1950s as well. And for a particular generation, they still go to these places. Kind of that would be their afternoon drinks on a Saturday before they might move on elsewhere. And so that still holds that space for many in the community. After hours, the infamous catacombs at 13 Fitzwilliam Place offered uninhibited sexual freedom, which was immortalised by Brendan Behan himself when he said, "Where men had women had men, and women had women." And I think he wrote a poem in relation to how he availed of the bisexual frivolity in there himself, as I think one of our first public bisexual individuals. Bewley's Cafe then on Grafton Street, and that is kind of a frequent thing that comes up in the conversations. Bewley's is often the place where the community goes for its fry up in the mornings after Flikkers, or it's a really nice space where even just if you're not going for a drink, you'll go in for a cup of tea. And that culture of Bewley's being part of queer socialisation and queer spaces emerges from 1948 onwards. So what's happening in the 40s and the 50s and somewhat into the 60s? These are quiet, semi-public spaces where the community isn't necessarily naming themselves. It's a congregation of predominantly men, to a lesser extent women, and not necessarily hand-holding or making it very obvious why they're there. So that's the 50s and 60s. And then I'm sure you're very familiar with these two bars, but of course they can't go unmentioned. You have Bartley Dunn's and Rice's, and these become, in the later years, the pre-drinking spots before people go to the Hirschfeld Centre. As I will mention in a few slides' time, you actually couldn't avail of drinks in the Hirschfeld, and many people who were going there for the first time certainly had to take a bit of Dutch courage to cross the threshold. So, and others just wanted to go in on a bit of a buzz. So they would pre-drink in Bartley Dunn's and Rice's. But before the Hirschfeld, these were also the central places that people would go to. Fun fact, many of the patrons who went to the Hirschfeld, because they didn't have a license to sell, used to wear cowboy boots, and they'd put a naggin of vodka down the boots to sneak it in, and then they would either kind of down it in the toilet or just swig it on the dance floor, and if someone gave out to them from management, they'd be like, "Oh, it's just poppers, what are you talking about?" So yeah, there's a little fun fact. Many more of them coming. So Bartley Dunn's was located at 32 Lower Stevens Green, and it was beloved from the 1950s. And the proprietor really did not necessarily like the fact that it was a gay bar and would deny the fact that this was a gay bar. And people would go in and they would say, "Is this the gay bar?" "This isn't a fucking gay bar." And this was such a frequent refrain from this bar manager to so many in the community. But fun fact, another fun fact, one day there was a civil servant from the Department of Finance sitting in Bartley Dunn's, and a very, very tall, very handsome, very big man walks in, devilishly good looking. And he says to himself, "I know who that man is. He looks really familiar. I've seen him in something." So the guy sits down and orders a pint of Guinness, and with a very deep, velvety Midwestern accent, turns around to the civil servant at the bar and says, "Oh, well, hello there, I'm Rock Hudson." So your man goes, "Oh my God, this is Rock Hudson, the Leonardo DiCaprio, the Brad Pitt of us, like one of the most famous men in the world." Surely he knows he's in a gay bar and he's in the wrong place. And he was like going, "Okay, it's 5 o'clock now. This place is going to start hopping with gay men in about an hour, and he's going to know the mistake he has made." An hour came, and a mistake he had not made, because let's just say Rock Hudson started having lots of fun in Bartley Dunn's, and then subsequently in Rice's. So he was in Dublin for this one weekend, shooting a movie in the Gaiety Theatre with Julie Andrews. And in between shoots, when they were getting shots ready, he would nip on over and have a good time, have maybe a little kiss, and then leave. And I kind of think that reflects Ireland's early gay social scene for a number of reasons. One, you have this Hollywood superstar, one of the most famous men in the world, walking into a gay bar. He's also publicly married because he is gay and identifies as gay, but for the public and the PR machine of Hollywood, has to be in this arranged marriage. He goes into this place and no one says a word. Everyone keeps stump about the fact that one of the most famous men in the world was there. So it just went to show that how many people would actually protect him. But also it goes to show how subterranean and underground the scene was, that he could go there and no one else or the tabloids would spot him. So that kind of goes to show you the vibrancy of Bartley Dunn's and Rice's. And David Norris, in his biography, and I kind of pulled this quote, I'm not too sure if it's fair, I wasn't there at the time, but he said the clientele of Bartley Dunn's were theatrical old queens. So not necessarily too sure if that's fair. The ones whom I've spoken with that went to Bartley Dunn's were not theatrical old queens, although I'm sure many went. Rice's then was located at Stephen's Green and South King Street on a corner with 2 entrances. And that offered a welcoming front bar for Dublin's lesbian and gay patrons. Despite, again, the owner's denials that this was a gay space. You know, you're seeing a theme beginning to emerge here. We're happy to take the Dorothy dollar and the pink pound, but we're just not going to name this place as a gay or queer or lesbian space. So there was a section in Rice's, and again, very insulting, but many of the people who spoke to me said that there was a section for the younger patrons, and then the older patrons sat in a particular section, and that was referred to as the geriatric ward. Again, somewhat unfair, and I suppose kind of like how we refer to Bridie's Bar in the George's Jurassic Park now. Again, possibly unfair. But yeah, so therein you can see, or maybe not so fair, who knows. Other notable spots, just to kind of give you, I won't go into them. You have the Viking Bar on Dame Street, which was opened as Dublin's first openly gay bar in 1979. So this is the first time that we're saying, actually, this is a gay bar and we're not going to pretend it's not. So come on in. That in particular, because it was just around the corner from the Hirschfeld Centre, that was like generally the place to go for the pre-drinks beforehand, before you went to dance your booty off. Other places were the Pygmalion, which is now the Hairy Lemon, the South William, now the Metro Cafe, and the Parliament Inn, now the Turk's Head. So I'm sure I'm seeing lots of nods of the head, so I'm kind of imagining that this is triggering some core memories for you all. But yeah, there was a clear concentration of queer spaces emerging in Dublin at this time. And Hannah Flam's work and her thesis has begun to look at this as well. And she's developed a really fabulous map that is available online of the spaces around Dublin at the time. So, from all of that, we of course naturally have to come to the Irish gay rights movement and the Fownes Centre, because the Hirschfeld Centre is really important and one of the first institutions of its kind in Europe, but it is not the first centre that emerges. In fact, that is the Phoenix Club, which is located at Parnell Square. So, in 1974, the Irish gay rights movement come together after a conference on human sexuality at the University of Coleraine with a number of activists from Northern Ireland. So a number of civil rights movements emerge from this conference, where activists come together and say, we've got to sort out criminalisation, north and south of the border, and we've got to become more publicly visible. So in this sense, we have the Phoenix Club that emerges. And what the IGRM want to do is to provide cohesion to the movement. It's great to have an organisation that's put together, but what's really important is we need a space, an actual site, where we can put shape to this organisation, where we can actually have people come in, either to help on the phone line, to work a phone line, or to meet people, right? A movement is only as good as having a space. So that was always really crucial. So it becomes Dublin's first dedicated gay and lesbian space. It hosts discos, women-only nights, even had a drama group. So, you know, very diverse in terms of the culture it was offering. Speaker forums and the Tell a Friend helpline. Tell a Friend actually begins at the Phoenix Club with IGRM and then moves over to the Hirschfeld Centre eventually. It was also crucial for creating lesbian spaces. And a common thread that's going to come throughout this talk is, shock horror, lesbians are often minoritized within the history and often left out. And there's a number of, you know, very hurtful fractures that emerged and have emerged in terms of the oral histories that I've collected. But in the early days, there was really prominent individuals in the movement, such as Terry Blanche and Phil Carson. Terry Blanche, who is now passed, I think of 2 years ago. I dedicated my book last year to her. She was a really fabulous person, by the way. And every person I spoke to, for some reason, always remembered Terry with a set of keys going around. She always had a set of keys in the Phoenix Club that opened all the doors, and this is just always everyone's memory. But Terry and Phil become shining lights for so many lesbians in Dublin and around the country, because there's actually women in these places where they can meet. So they establish what's called the Lavender Room, where it becomes the lesbian social meeting space in the Phoenix Club. So all of these things are happening and emerging, and unfortunately, as with the gays and civil rights groups more broadly, tensions emerge around the direction of politics. So leaders within the IGRM have disagreements over how visible the movement should be versus whether they should be dedicating resources to socializing or just politics. So all of these tensions emerge in a split. And unfortunately, because of the split and a number of reasons, they lose the lease on the Phoenix Club in Parnell Square and are subsequently left somewhat destitute with nowhere to actually have anything. So there's no real space in the community to go to for a number of years outside of the bars that I've kind of mentioned. And this becomes really crucial to the story of the Hirschfeld because a number of lessons are learned from the Phoenix Club and the tensions with the actual IGRM. Centrally, it was, okay, we need to actually get our stuff together and take ownership of the space. So because it was leased, they had to actually get a mortgage. They said, if we can actually own a building and own a site and take out a mortgage and control it for ourselves, then we can have more control of our destiny and we can have a more sustainable space. So when the Hirschfeld Centre comes together, that is kind of part of it, taking ownership of it. But that becomes a problem down the line. And that also emerges in a lot of the remembrances from individuals. So then we come to actually waking the Hirschfeld itself, the project that I am actually now doing. So what does the project look like? And by the way, I'm still more than happy if anyone in this room has not spoken to me and wants to share their story. We are still gathering personal narrations from people. So if you want to chat, this is still very much an open project. There is no shut door here. So, as I said, after the IGRM splits, 25 activists come together, among which include David Norris, Bernard Keogh, Edmund Lynch, and Tom McLean, and they say, we need to do something about this. We need to get a space together. So they found the National Gay Federation, and from the National Gay Federation, they then say, let's establish a building. So they quickly identify Temple Bar as the place to go. Now, Temple Bar, and I see we have an intergenerational room here today. Temple Bar is not the Temple Bar you are familiar with. Temple Bar back then was essentially run by foxes and sex workers. It was meant to be the site of a CIE bus station, and it was under development, potentially is happening. And there was a hold over development in the area as a result of that. So warehouses were going pretty cheap there. And as many of the individuals that I spoke to said to me, the Temple Bar was mainly made up of odds and sods. You had like a vegetarian cafe around the corner, vintage clothing shops, which ironically is what the Hirschfeld is now. You had all of these kind of random things, but there was kind of no cohesion. And it was actually quite dangerous at night. But crucially, it was off the beaten path. No one could see you going into buildings. And that was an appeal because there was a level of discretion. So Temple Bar is identified. And also the area has low rents, a bohemian atmosphere, and discreet, making it ideal. Initially, it was considered, let's call the Hirschfeld, and this was an origin story that I had no idea about. It was originally going to be called the Oscar Wilde Centre. That was flagged initially amongst the community because they said, oh, well, Oscar Wilde is clearly an identifiable Irish man. Seeing the Wilde Centre on the wall is going to clearly indicate this is a space for us. And then they went, actually, therein lies the problem. If we make this obviously gay and have Oscar Wilde as the name, people will know who we are. People will know what we're doing here. So we need to have something a little bit more subtle. So Magnus Hirschfeld is actually selected as the name. Magnus Hirschfeld was a sexologist that was researching sexuality in the 1920s and 1930s in Germany. But when Hitler rose to being chancellor in Germany, his entire research institute on sexology was burned by the Nazis. So subsequent to this, renaming the centre as the Hirschfeld Centre, or calling the centre the Hirschfeld Centre, was a symbol within the Irish movement of also identifying with European history. Not necessarily looking to Stonewall, which so many people tend to do, and Stonewall is important, but it tends to overlook the rich queer history on the continent of Europe. So it was an attempt to connect with that. So volunteers essentially then, once a building is selected at 10 Fownes Street, volunteers come in to do it up. Edmund Lynch is working in RTE at the time, and he sees in the back lot of RTE that they're throwing out the set for the National Song Contest. So this was used for the Ireland selection process for the Eurovision, and he said to RTE, "Are you using that?" And they went, "No, we want to see the back of it." So he hired engineers and carpenters that he knew, working pro bono, to bring it from the back lot of RTE and to take it to 10 Fownes Street. And they built a really, really good state-of-the-art set in the Hirschfeld, and that's what became the backdrop of Flikkers. Crucially, and I'll say this more when we get to the Flikkers section of the talk, the sound system in the Hirschfeld was like no other. It really was the hottest disco in town. And that's because the community said, if we're going to make a disco, we need to have this as a commercial arm of the building, and we want people coming in buying tickets. So we need to make the sound top notch. So they actually got sound engineers from RTE to install the system as well to make sure it was at a really high production quality. So they had TV and radio engineers coming in to actually create this. And the sound of Flikkers is often what people remember the most. It's so strange when people are telling you their remembrances and in their own memoryscapes, how they actually access their memories of the Hirschfeld is through song and smell. And they always say, "I smell the poppers going up the stairs. I hear Pete Burns' song." And that's how they then get to the stories, somatic and sound. So volunteers essentially rework the space. And beyond the disco, the Hirschfeld also has a cinema, a 55-seater cinema called the Hirschfeld Biograph, run by the fabulous Johnny McAvoy, who was an absolute cinephile, who similarly also worked in RTE. And he had just an absolutely phenomenal taste in cinema. And many people's favourite memories of the Hirschfeld isn't going to Flikkers, it's going to the Hirschfeld Biograph, engaging in culture, engaging in movies that they would never have seen. Vito Russo's The Celluloid Closet had a work in progress premiere in the Hirschfeld Centre. He hadn't even finished it, but he showed some stills and clips on a projector in the Biograph there. And there was also a seminar room where the Tuesday talk shop was held, and Eamon Summers, who is here, was one of was the key person behind the Tuesday talk shop. And the Tuesday talk shop comes up in so many people's recollections. It's a space where essentially seminars were held, classes were held, or just simple discussions were held where people thrashed out ideas in the community. One participant remembers Maeve Binchy coming in to the Tuesday talk shop. And that's quite something at the time when the community is, so vilified, so invisible, to have someone like Maeve Binchy come in, who was a writer at the time in the Irish Times. And she came in and gave a little workshop on writing and pitching to newspapers and just generally about how to write good articles. Helping a community find its voice, as it were. And also was just there to chat with people about writing. So a really beautiful show of solidarity. In another Tuesday talk shop session, they discussed how to wear condoms because there were no condoms freely available in Ireland. So this was actually a forum and a space where people could educate themselves on these crucial things. And then other Tuesday talk shops, people would have arguments, healthy arguments, intellectual ones about what does gay and queer culture mean. So what you're seeing here is me essentially giving you a really diverse representation of the multiple things that the Hirschfeld was. It wasn't just this one thing. People might walk in to do Flikkers, but another might go to the Hirschfeld Biograph and engage with queer culture more broadly. So that's the Hirschfeld as kind of our origin story as to how we get there. So the overview of the project. So far we have collected 60 oral history interviews, and the project's been ongoing for 3 years. It's been going on so long purely because we want to be as representative as possible. In one instance, 2 years in, we realised we'd far too many men, so we had to balance it out and look for more lesbians and get intersectionality into the project and get just more diverse voices in there that aren't just the people that we all know, right, that usually get the credit and the kudos and whatnot, but actually finding the people who just, and what I was really interested in, I am interested in the politics, but the people who just went there and in one instance, one person came on a tractor from Meath and parked the tractor in Temple Bar on Fownes Street, went in, and then got the tractor back to me. And when I heard that, I kind of went, they're the stories I want. I want that person who, from Monday to Friday, had nothing and had to be straight, but hopped in their tractor and came down to Temple Bar on the Saturday. That is the story that I was interested in. And there's many more of that, by the way, that I'll tell you. So data collection was kind of predominantly from 2021 to 2024. And we have a very iterative and flexible methodology. So this isn't just sitting down with cold interviews. I built relationships with these people. I kind of would come to their houses, have coffee, tea, make sure that they liked me, or at the very least felt that they could vibe with me to tell me their story, because sometimes maybe people didn't want to and weren't comfortable. That's absolutely okay. You know, it's all about their experience and making them feel safe. So many of them were one-on-one, but quite quickly, many of the lesbian activists in the community wanted to actually speak to us as collectives, because lesbians tended to do things collectively and have collective decision-making structures rather than hierarchical ones. So about 4 groups of friends from the lesbian community from the 80s and 90s said, we actually kind of want to get together and do it with you. So I rented a room, an outhouse, and had 4 sessions with lesbians. No gay men did it, and I did put it out there to them, but it was an interesting finding that emerged. And they were very interesting as well, because they were triggering memories off of each other, and if they weren't in the room together, I don't think as much memory stuff would have come out. So they're just some of the things that we've been looking at. And because a lot of the Hirschfeld, a lot of the material got destroyed in the fire, if you go into the National Library of Ireland and you look at some of the documents that came from the Irish Court Archive, or came from the Hirschfeld, you'll see the singed edges from some documents that were saved from the fire the night it got destroyed in 1987. So that is our overview, and what I'm now going to do is get into the really interesting stuff, okay? So we've done the legwork of the housekeeping, like brushing our teeth, right? We got to set the context. Now I'm going to tell you some of the ambivalent and contested recollections, because that is what a lot of this project has been. And if anyone recognises this is Dermot Moore, the son of Phil Moore, working at the coffee dock in the Hirschfeld Centre, and you can see the prices there. My God, 25 pence for a Fanta orange and a lemon. Could you imagine that, right? Now I think it's like 3.60. So what I quickly discovered, and this shouldn't have been a shock to me, but there was a lot of contestation in terms of how people remembered it. For example, one person said a lot of people have said there was a pool table downstairs. Then whenever I ask about the pool table, 50% say there was no pool table, it never existed, right? But 50% are absolutely determined there was a pool table there, and then others will say there wasn't. So I'm just trusting there was a pool table, but that reflects the kind of contestation and how people remember the Hirschfeld. So some just remember it through music and dancing. Some are all of these. Others are just exclusively activism. They're not necessarily getting to avail of the actual dance floor because they're too busy working, either working the doors, working in the clothes, working at the cloakroom and whatnot. Some are managing the phone lines. There's also a cafe. The cafe in the Hirschfeld, I didn't have space to put that here, but the cafe was running at a loss, and Tony O'Shea, who was the centre manager, the only paid individual in the Hirschfeld at the time, and he was on a minuscule salary, but he was the centre manager, and essentially he said, I'm sick of this place running at a loss, so we're going to put this out to a franchise. So Terry Blanche and a partner were actually the ones to win the franchise first, and they developed a restaurant and cafe called What's Cooking. And Terry used to get her mother to bake pound cake, and that was sold there. So the Hirschfeld during the day became a cafe and a restaurant. Curry and lasagna were apparently the things that people remember eating there. So there you are. The existence of a bar cafe, and then alcohol being served versus not being served. So towards the Hirschfelds last year, they get a really strange loophole in the licensing where wine can be sold. And this is an attempt to try and create more revenue to save the centre, because it's struggling financially at this point because a commercial scene has emerged. Sides nightclub, for example, emerges on Dame Street and gives competition for Flikkers. So Hirschfeld begins to run at a loss to a degree. So some key themes that have emerged, and these will all be in the book. And I'm going to give you some tidbits now, of course. This isn't just a painful plug for the book, by the way, but it sort of is. But yes, these will be in the book. First one was unwanted guests and unexpected visitors. What the hell does that mean? So in one instance, I did an interview with an individual who was in the seminary in Maynooth. And he was in the cloisters of Maynooth one day and said to himself, right, I know the Hirschfeld Centre exists. I don't care. I've got to get in there. So because Maynooth was closed down to priests, it was a lot more strict at the time, he had to scale the wall of St. Patrick's College to get out to Maynooth Village, to then get the 66 bus to Dublin City Centre. Gets to Dublin City Centre and then walks up Fownes Street and then says, no, I can't do this, and goes back to the seminary. Then the next week he kicks himself and he goes, no, I'm going back this week. So does the same routine, hops the wall, gets the bus, goes in. And when he goes in to the group that are meeting at the cafe that Sunday morning, who does he run into? Only a seminarian who had just hopped the wall that is in the room next to him. So there was a lot of this kind of thing that happened in the Hirschfeld. Oftentimes, a really frequent thing that came up was people always saw their school bully there. And their school bully was in the arms of another man. So the person who had homophobically abused them when they were in school in the 60s and the 70s was there doing what they had done, what they had homophobically bullied them for. And they got some satisfaction from that, but also upset. Other people saw their local priests. Again, shock horror. Bernard Lynch, who was one of the, Father Bernard Lynch, the AIDS priest, who was one of the interviews for the project, said he saw so many priests from around the country that had, he would have known. Because shock horror, there were gay priests, that's no big surprise. So unwanted guests were a frequent thing, and unexpected visitors also. The Legion of Mary, who tend to crop up everywhere in Irish history, they would stand outside the Hirschfeld Centre and say that you're all sinning when they were walking out of Flikkers nightclub. So they would throw the Legion of Mary leaflets at them, or just basically say you're all disgraceful. And one individual recalled going out to them and saying, I am Mary and here is my Legion. So trying to give them the two fingers, as it were. So AIDS activism and politics was really important in the Hirschfeld. And one of the crucial remembrances from the participants in the project was, and they always say, and it's kind of why I've titled the chapter that, the vanishing beautiful young men of the Hirschfeld. The men who would be there dancing in Flikkers one day, and the next time an individual would see them would be in St. James's ward, a ward in St. James's. Vincent Hanley, who frequently DJ'd there, was one such person to die from an AIDS-related illness. And then Bill Hughes is telling me the story of, he gave me his remembrance and said that there was a beautiful man from Czechoslovakia that used to go to the Hirschfeld, and he then would see him on the dance floor and they would always remember each other from being on the dance floor. And then when Bill was going in to see Vincent Hanley, his dear friend in James's, he saw Jan on the bed beside him. And this is where those vanishing young beautiful men went to. So the Flikkers dance floor suddenly became a lot more empty than it used to be. So, and the Hirschfeld is also crucial for actually giving a structure to AIDS activism in Ireland. The first leaflet, the Gay Health Action leaflet, is produced from the Hirschfeld Centre. There is a helpline around AIDS established from the Hirschfeld, and two senior professors from San Francisco, whose names are evading me now, my God, I'm having a brain fart, but I will have it by the end of the talk. They come over and give a seminar about AIDS and sex education in the Hirschfeld. So you also have the politics, formal politics, radical activism, and the divides that emerge time and time again, be that lesbians versus gay men, left-wing gay people versus the more respectable middle-class gay people. Like, you have all of these alliances and fractures that emerge. One really beautiful one was the children of the Hirschfeld Centre. And those are the people who attended the NGF youth group, and the likes of Dermot Moore and the likes of people like Phil Moore, who started Parents Inquiry from the Hirschfeld Centre. And there is a huge amount of people who participated in the NGF youth group. And one actually just said to me, I will always consider myself a child of the Hirschfeld Centre. That was who my parent was. And then this really struck with me, and I kind of asked anyone who was in the NGF youth group, this person said that they were a child of the Hirschfeld Centre, and they went, that's it. I've never been able to put words to that, but that's exactly how I feel about it. That's my family. So there's a chapter on that and how this creates kinship with the youth, but also, one person ended up becoming the private secretary to the Prime Minister of Australia, and that individual said being a child of the Hirschfeld and the activism and the training they got from everyone around him there is what created his career for him and gave him the confidence. So there's lots of really, really beautiful things like that. So what I'm going to specifically talk to you about, and we have about 15 minutes left, is shared and fractured first encounters and Flikkers. So in terms of the shared and fractured first encounters, one of the most significant recollections from the Hirschfeld is the ritual, as it became known, or the pilgrimage. And that was simply the first time you would cross the threshold. Every single person I spoke to said that they never crossed that threshold for the first time. And if they did, they were under the duress of alcohol. They recall going to Fownes Street, walking up and down, going by the central bank, deciding if they're going to go in or not, seeing if there's people coming up the street, or even watching it from afar, looking who's going in. Do they look gay? Do they look untoward? One person thought that they were so terrified to go in because they just thought it was a perpetual orgy inside. And they were kind of going, oh my God, I don't necessarily know if I want this on my first time. Was grossly disappointed when he got in the door. But, you know, this anxiety and fear and trepidation was really, really important. And we call this the emotional geographies of the Hirschfeld Centre, where people have this relationship with Temple Bar, that they're so afraid to cross that threshold. And we call this threshold crossing because it takes so much time, effort, and labour for them to actually cross over the door at Fownes Street. One such story that I will share, and I've been allowed to share this, is story of John Kilcullen. So John, one day, yes, he drove up to the Hirschfeld Centre 5 times in his car and parked outside. And he said he just couldn't get the bravery to go in. And then one day he just went, oh, screw it, I'm going to go in and that's that. And he went in, he goes, and it was just, you know, a regular place. It was very boring. I don't know what I was expecting. But he goes, that was me finding myself. So oftentimes as well, shock horror, gay men referred to them as Dorothy when they were going to the Hirschfeld for the first time, because they said this was their Emerald City. And the bricks, the cobblestones of Temple Bar was their yellow brick road to cross over that threshold. And so many people call the cobblestones on Temple Bar their yellow brick road, so that really struck at me. So many refer to entering the Hirschfeld as entering Oz for the first time. And a lot of participants, all gay men, as I said, refer to themselves as Dorothy. And there was that ritualistic practice of pacing and walking around Temple Bar with anxiety prior to entering. And first encounters often happened through telefriend. You know, oftentimes it wasn't just going up to the actual location, it was ringing up a phone line and having someone on the other end coaxing you to have a meet up and maybe go to the Hirschfeld Centre with them. So helplines were really vital gateways for people to have their first encounters. Telefriend and the lesbian line in particular. And this offered a really confidential counselling service, but also information for so many who use the phone line as a starting point to discover the Hirschfeld and its supportive community. A number of people, you know, Reg Dean, for example, spoke with me for this project, and he was one of the workers on the helpline. And Joni Crone was another figure that was on the lesbian line. And they would have so many people calling in, and to get them to the Hirschfeld Centre, they would have to meet them in a safe space, usually in a hotel lobby or in a cafe, and kind of just say to them, look, listen, we're normal, nothing to fear here. Would you like to come over to the Hirschfeld Centre? And we'll show you what it's all about. And then you can choose to come back if you want. And that was so many people's first way of getting in, just having that safe pair of hands. We've personal stories like Mink Quinlan or Owen Casterly. Owen Casterly's story I found not hilarious, but he found it hilarious himself. He had to actually go into his neighbour's house to actually use their phone because he didn't have a landline, and he said that landlines were really expensive in Dublin at the time. He didn't want to be seen in the public phone box, so he went into his neighbour's room and rang telefriend, terrified that he was going to be heard by the neighbour outside of the door. These are the kinds of things people did. So volunteers bridged private and public worlds. Volunteers such as Martin Barnes, Reg Dean, Pauline O'Donnell, Joni Crone answered calls and helped people in distress. Another crucial piece outside of the phone lines was In Dublin magazine. Does anyone remember In Dublin magazine? There was a placement in the magazine that advertised the Hirschfeld, had a PO box and whatnot. And this was often how people actually had their first encounters, through that. Or they would meet someone that was gay from In Dublin magazine, because you could place ads, and they would bring you to the Hirschfeld Centre. That was how Tony Walsh, for example, whom I'm sure many of you know, that's how he got to the Hirschfeld for the first time. He met a guy, they went on a date, and had his first awakening then in Flikkers that night. So the courage and the ritual, as I said, you have the moment of fear and anticipation. You also have slow personal rites of passage. Failed attempts are crucial to people's first ever experiences of the Hirschfeld. And then observing before belonging, looking at the community around you, circling the block, watching the door, And many people were afraid of getting queer bashed. It happened so frequently at the Hirschfeld Centre outside. Many people tried to break in some instances. In some instances, they would light toilet roll on fire and try to shove it through the letterbox, shove black cats through the letterbox. You know, there were threats at points to that building. And here's just some recollections here. Kieran Wallace's is a particular favourite of mine. I walked by the Hirschfeld trying to build up the courage, and I could hear the music coming from inside. I know this sounds made up, but they were playing Whitney Houston's I Want to Dance with Somebody. And here was me just walking by, not able to pick up the courage to go in. All I wanted to do was go inside and dance with somebody. It took me a few more months before I could walk in. I couldn't walk in on my own. And that stuck at me because he just had this really effective emotion when he was telling me about it. He said, for God's sake, Whitney Houston was inside singing I Want to Dance with Somebody, and that's all I wanted to do, just get in there and just dance. And what was so bad about it? Jerry Moore's story says, you know, he would go for a few drinks beforehand to build up the confidence with friends because they were afraid of getting queer bashed. So therein you can see some of the kind of fractured remembrances and first encounters there. So that again is a snapshot into this chapter and this theme. So our second piece is, and make sure I'm good for time, we're good for time. Fragmented remembrance and the politics of dance. Flikkers at the Hirschfeld. So again, Flikkers is such a rich site of history in this place. From the sounds, the smells, the outrageous scandals, the tiffs, lovers cheating on whoever. This has been one of the most fun parts of actually doing this project. And dancing at the Hirschfeld is fractured and contested and linked to emotions associated with feeling safe and welcome. And within this space itself, you know, people say Flikkers was great, the sound system was amazing, but it was dark, it was foggy, it was jammed, it was sweaty, and we were all bumping off each other, but it was so fun and it was so amazing, and it just had this affect. So in interviews, Hirschfeld denizens not only reflect on the centrality of dance to their experiences, but also comment on the socio-political dynamics of who felt welcomed and sometimes who did not. While Flikkers was this site of queer joy, absolute gay abandon, it was also a site of hurt for some of the participants as well. Many people felt alienated from the dance floor. Many people suffered discrimination themselves from within the community. So it wasn't necessarily all that rosy. I mean, it was really good and fantastic, but there is still not a joyous remembrance of Flikkers. And dance becomes an embodied medium through which people can express their identity, negotiate power and privilege, and also where actual privilege can emerge on the dance floor, which we do actually still see in our own gay spaces now. So the soundtrack for Flikkers was nothing short of sublime. It was absolutely phenomenal. It had a process where it subscribed to subscriptions of house music from the likes of France, the US, Germany, getting all of the top tracks, all of the top vinyls, all of the top singles. Tony O'Shea, whom I mentioned, who was the centre manager, he told me a very fun story about whenever they would go travelling or had the luck to go to New York or somewhere in Central Europe, they would look up where the record companies were based and they'd go in and try and bum a few free records off them because, you know, there was no money to run this place. While they could pay for subscriptions and whatnot, it was difficult to access a huge amount of material. So he went into, I think it was Sony or Universal, one of them, and went up to the guy and said, listen, we're running this disco in Dublin. Have you any tracks for us to play? And the guy at the desk says, yeah, we've got this up-and-coming girl, Madonna. She's not really going to go anywhere, so there's some 7 inches. And he got Holiday. And Madonna's first play of Holiday was on the Flikkers dance floor. Music in Ireland was often played at Flikkers first, before it even hit the charts here. Because of the likes of Tony O'Shea and the likes of subscribing to these kinds of music networks, they would go and get these records and play them first. It became the hottest disco in town to the extent that even straight people started to go there. The Irish Times, the Irish Press, the Sunday World, all went there and gave the disco rave reviews, saying, well, this might be a gay disco, this is the best music in town. You got to get yourselves down here. So while a really significant record collection was developed, there was even a walk-in closet at the back of the dance floor where you went in and it was wall-to-wall record against that closet with a huge selection. The Hirschfeld also developed a significant amount of talent. It had an open door policy to anyone who wanted to be a DJ, and they also encouraged people to train. For example, Jerry Moore was in the NGF youth group, and he said, he's now a DJ, and he said that all started when the Flikkers management said, listen, if anyone in the youth group wants to mess around on the decks, feel free to do so. You have the full run of it on Sunday afternoons for 3 hours. And if you want to bring any records home, you can. Just sign them in, sign them back out, and train away. And Jerry said that's where he trained. And eventually he got a gig for 2 hours on a Thursday night. And there was a pipeline of talent of creating really innovative culture. So the likes of Tony Walsh, Joni Crone, Izzy Kamikaze, Paul Webb were significant people on the scene at the time. Tony O'Shea himself said he was a DJ. He thinks everyone hated his taste. So he said he used to play jazz and everyone hated it. So he used to usually clear the dance floor. So, but he said it was fun to do. So Flikkers nurtured this DJ talent and was really experimental in terms of beat per minute and having 12 minute-long tracks and mixing, and actually really developed innovative mixing as well that really caught a particular kind of sound in the Dublin scene at the time. And patrons remember, more than of it as a disco, it was an escape into an entirely new world. One really significant thing about the Hirschfeld was, while it had all of this disco music, beats per minute, really innovative, it also had a beautiful thing called the slow set. Now, you might be thinking, why the hell was there a slow set in the gay bar at the time? Every single individual I spoke to mentioned the slow set. Some people said it was the most transformative experience of their lives. They were so familiar with ballroom culture of Ireland, right? Where it was men on one side, women on the other, meeting in the middle and dancing to a slow set. But here in this space, it was men dancing with men, women dancing with women. And this was just insane to them. And the fact that they could dance to tracks just was unbelievable. And people say that is what their favourite memory of the Hirschfeld Centre is. That was the moment where they could perhaps go in for the swoop for the kill with whatever or whoever they had their eye on that night, asking them to do a slow set. So that was significantly transformative. So at Flikkers, dancing wasn't just leisure, it was also rebellion. And it was a form of politics. The politics just didn't happen in the rooms upstairs when they were making decisions. Dancing was political too. Wal Kilroy says, it goes way beyond hedonism. Dancing at the Hirschfeld was an act of liberation, of self-affirmation. It's an act of community building. Dancing becomes so powerful, a public ritual of self-expression, of resilience. And it brought people together in unfiltered queer joy. Donald Traynor recalls men dancing with poppers in their hands to Motown tracks, like, and he said it was just absolutely wild, sensory overload, but absolutely phenomenal and amazing. And participants described dancing as euphoric and deeply meaningful. So some songs that have come up. I also have the Flikkers playlist. I will share that with you all. So I'll have it publicly available for you all online. What's on that? Tom Robinson's Glad to be Gay was a call to the dance floor where everyone got out and screamed the lyrics, Glad to be Gay. Pete Burns, Donna Summer, although Donna Summer was banned in the Hirschfeld for a little while for comments she had allegedly made around gay men deserving to having got AIDS, although that is now disputed. So there's two camps on that, whether she did say it or whether she didn't say it. Not for me to decide, but Donna was banned for a little while. Donna Summer was crucial. I'll Never Love This Way Again, strangely, has come up with so many people as part of the slow set. That also brings a tear to there was 4 people that I spoke to that mentioned I'll Never Love This Way Again and got emotional when sharing their stories with me. Because it brought them back to the people they loved and lost, and also their youth as well. And while the Flikkers was a disco, many people refer to it as like a parish hop or a ceilidh. It had that kind of feel mixed in with that, a strange Irish feel. So some fractures did, of course, emerge. Many of the women referenced the fact that oftentimes men would block them from coming onto the dance floor. So Bernie Fagan says there were men who didn't want us there and who would physically block your entrance. Then you hear a fellow talking about the smell of fish. It was awful. So some women kind of had really bad experiences on the dance floor. I mean, one experience, sure, but this came up a few times. Izzy Kamikaze says, I liked dance music and I liked clubs, and there weren't many places you could hang out, but oftentimes in Flikkers, you could be the only woman on the dance floor. Women had the run of Flikkers on Thursday nights, and generally that was when they would come together, they would run the phone lines for 2 hours, and then they would have 4 hours on the Flikkers dance floor. And they would rotate DJ week on week, and they generally played women. They generally did not play men. So sisters are doing it for themselves. Shock horror was a track and a call to the dance floor for many of the people there. And then it evades me now, but a lesbian album from America, which again, I've lost the name of. Joni Crone made sure that was there. She always ensured that there was music from lesbians that was actually there. And then another aspect was actually schisms between the gay men themselves. A few said that there was older gay men were blocked from the dance floor, and then others were the clones. That there was a group of people who were the clones who looked like Freddie Mercury, tight jeans, tight vests, mustaches, and they would essentially have their cabal on the dance floor and wouldn't necessarily be inclusive of people coming in. And this is all kind of divides around body image, attractiveness, who was in the in-group, who was in the out-group. So there were kinds of, while it was joyous and it was great, it did have these problems as part and parcel of it. And, when we tell these histories, we kind of have to tell the good with the bad. If it's truly a social history, that's going to be reflective and inclusive. It's got to include all that as well. So I understand we are at time. So there are so much else in this project, and I've seen lots of nods here, so I think I've triggered a good few memories for you, and also I've kind of given some of you a bit of a laugh, I hope. Some other tensions that have emerged, this will not surprise you, the ownership of the centre. That's actually kind of what darkens the last days of the Hirschfeld. That is covered in the book, it will be there. So the community felt that they owned it because it was volunteer run. So many people did work unpaid and supported it, and felt like the centre belonged to the community, whereas there was the shareholder ownership, where Hirschfeld Enterprises Limited had control of the building. They fronted the capital, they fronted the money, and felt like when the building was sold that the money should go to them. So these are divides that emerge in the remembrances. Some say it should have gone back to the community and been community owned. Others said it shouldn't have been sold. Again, a really contested, hurtful time and it's kind of a sad end to the Hirschfeld story. Rebuilding the centre, whether it should be community reinvestment or shareholder profit. That again is kind of related to the ownership. Conflicting perceptions of control. How was the building actually controlled? There was a perception that it was inclusive and democratic. Other people say it wasn't. Joni Crone wrote an essay called Slaying the Minute's Dragon, and that's available in Páraic Robinson's Gaze Against Imperialism, also in the Irish Queer Archive. But Joni essentially said, this institution is so bureaucratic, it's so middle class in its structure, there's decision-making processes, there's boards, and everything is so slow. Let's just cut it all out and have collective decision-making. But that did not necessarily go down too well. And then there was a perception that the Hirschfeld was for middle-class men and was kind of not necessarily as inclusive of some. That there are just some things that have come up. Gender divisions are really significant, in particular gendering within the gay community, kind of gendering gay men as feminine and whatnot, and also lesbians versus gay men. There's a really rich history there of clashes, collaborations, coalitions, and falling ins and fallings outs, and all of that stuff. And then labour and enjoyment. Quite crucially, one thing that, not that I was surprised by, but unpaid work, and those who ran the building and managed daily operations often worked for free and didn't get any benefit from doing that. They were doing this for the good of the community. And there was a lot of hurt around that. That fact that people were doing this, but those at the top were kind of benefiting from then the sale of the building. So that is kind of where the Hirschfeld is at right now. And it's part of the broader project of re-bricking the Hirschfeld, as I say. Our work shows that oral histories can rebuild a lost queer space as an ephemeral archive, keeping its stories alive and not being forgotten. The Hirschfeld Centre risks being forgotten because there's no formal archive about it. The generations that have used it, will one day die out. So myself and my collaborator, Maria Maggiore, seek to ensure that this archive is kept. It also has a multiplicity of meaning. As I said today, I've only given you 2 threads of the story of the Hirschfeld, but it meant different things to different people at different times. Then collaborative memory work. This isn't like me spouting stuff, although I am here spouting stuff as one individual, but I am the product of a really collaborative process with so many people, and it's their stories. I am just the conduit through which I'm hopefully trying to do a good job in communicating this history. So it's very much a collaborative piece of memory. And also grafted memories, right? Though we never experienced the Hirschfeld materially, myself and Maria, the collaborators, we have now begun to develop memories ourselves, grafting other people's experiences of the Hirschfeld and bringing them into our own. So when I hear Dead or Alive now, I think of Flikkers. There's nothing about it. And then a political commitment to keeping the Hirschfeld awake. There's so many rich stories here. So many really good things happened in this building, and bad, and can give us pause for how we write queer histories, but also how we can look to the mistakes made in the community and ensure that we don't make them again, right? Although, you know, history hasn't necessarily taught us all of that in the current age. But that's a different story. And of course, a call to action. Remembering queer spaces like the Hirschfeld is collective work. It's not just the work of me, my collaborator Maria Primaggiore, it's the work of all of us. Queer spaces are at risk now, purely because of the fact that with socialization on technology, less people are using these spaces. When the spaces go, they miss them. But we need to use these spaces if we want to keep them and have places for us. So I'd just like to thank you all for indulging me for an hour of talking about one of my favorite topics, the Hirschfeld Centre. And I'm happy to take any questions if you have any. And thank you for being here. Much appreciated.